Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm the host and producer of the Happy Hour, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And I should probably tell folks who don't know, my name is Olga Peters, and I am speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro, as well as Representative Robin Schy, who is the Vice Chair of Appropriations and also one of the sponsors, along with Emily, with a paid family leave medical bill that we are about to discuss here on the Happy Hour. So I'm so glad you can both join me today.
Thank you for having us.
Before we dive in, just a note to our listeners, we are pre-recording this on January 16th, and since this bill is in the process of beginning its journey, when you hear it on Friday, some things may have changed. But so we're talking about how things are on the 16th. Now, Emily, I am excited to talk about this bill with you, but I am a little curious. So the House or the legislature has tried to put through a paid family leave bill before, 2018 and 2020, I believe. The governor vetoed it both times.
Mm-hmm.
And so before we get into the nitty gritty of this bill, I'm just curious, why
What's
now?
different now?
What's different? Yeah.
That's everyone.
Start there.
Yeah, so that's every reporter's question and very few regular people's questions. Regular people are just like, yay, I might have family medical leave insurance. And the political question is always, what's different now? And so I think what's different now is two big things that we've talked about on the show so much.
Mm-hmm.
One is in the middle aftermath, whatever we're calling this particular phase of the pandemic. In this phase of the pandemic, I think we have all very clearly seen, and the vast majority of us experienced, what life is like without family medical leave insurance. We know that we used the unemployment insurance system early in the pandemic to do a square peg, round hole attempt to just keep people from starving to death or losing their housing because they were out of work. But that was not an appropriate use of the unemployment insurance system and wasn't good enough. And especially even now, we're still seeing a lot of parents needing to take time off from work to care for kids who are home because of COVID. We're still seeing a lot of people needing to take medical leave for themselves and not have their wages covered. And we're seeing, folks having babies or adopting grandkids or fostering and needing to take some real time to attend to their family and attend to bonding. And so there's what's different now, so many more people get it than got it 4 years ago or 6 years ago. That's one big one. And the other one that feels different to me is that I think the scale of solutions that we're willing to entertain is different for folks. With all of the federal investment, with all of how much we were able to see a sort of theory of economics play out. And that's when government spends for the good of the average citizen, people benefit immediately. Right. And it's worth those investments. And so we now have sort of a scale that's shifted in Vermont about what's possible in terms of appropriations numbers, in terms of program size numbers, that I think makes this conversation very different than it was 4 years ago. But I was not as involved 4 years ago as Representative Schy was, because I'm lead sponsor along with Robin this year. And 2 years ago, the two of us were the two lead sponsors when we were still hoping for Build Back Better to build back better. But 4 years ago, Robin was the lead sponsor when I was just a newbie legislator. So I'd love to hear from you, Robin, what feels different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. And Emily, I think that you've nailed a lot of it. That the notion of scale, our first raft of money from the federal government when the pandemic hit was $1.25 billion. Just think about that for a minute and what that means. Nothing like that had ever happened in our little state. And thank you again, Senator Leahy. Small state minimum. We had the second most money come in per capita of any place in the country, so that made a huge difference. And and seeing that when we do things for the good of families and people, it's not just the families that thrive, it's the communities, it's the businesses. We see the results of the whole economy just is a better place when we spend money for the good of all. We also have, in a practical sense, this time around, we have many more people in the legislature who see this as a priority. And so truly, in practical numbers, I believe we have enough people, should the governor choose to override it, to veto it, that we could override his veto, which I wouldn't say about everything. We're not looking to override vetoes just sort of willy-nilly and put stuff out there because we think we have the numbers. But this is such an important bill. And I feel more comforted that we don't have a lot of people reluctantly going along. We have people more enthusiastically going along.
Right.
And understand, because they really understand now, thanks to the pandemic. So I think we've all learned something from that.
And I would say it's not just thanks to the pandemic, which it is. And I'm really, on my list of reasons I'm grateful for the pandemic, that's one of them. But also we have a more diverse and a younger legislature than we had before, as well as more grandparents who have stepped in to care for children than we had before. And so the actual makeup of the people making these decisions is different than previously. And then since we're airing this on Friday, I would say that on Thursday, in a hypothetical futures yesterday, we introduced the bill with 104 signatures on it, 104 co-sponsors. And it's a lot of people saying, yes, this is one of my priorities this session. I'm putting my name on this piece of legislation before it even gets to committee.
Yeah. So I'd love us to run through just some of the nitty gritty of the bill. As I understand it, it would help people have 12 weeks of paid family medical leave. Funding for this would come through a payroll tax that would be split between employer and employee.
We're calling it's really like an insurance premium. I just
insurance premium. Is that politically better than a payroll tax?
Well, it's a paid family and medical leave insurance program. So it is insurance, just like we have health insurance and we have car insurance and we have homeowners insurance. This is a family leave and medical insurance program.
Thank you, Robin. But what are some other aspects of the program that, if it passes, would be in effect?
So there's it's leave for bonding, whether that is bonding with a child who was just born or bonding with a child who just joined the family. There's leave for your own illness or caring for a loved one. There's a very inclusive definition of family that we got legislative language from Colorado to work on. And so that feels very exciting for me, who's has always been in unconventional family arrangements, or non-normative, I guess. I don't want to call it conventional. And then we also included safe leave. So if you've experienced domestic violence, leave to care for yourself and your family through that process. Leave for deployment. If you have a family member deploying, it's a big household transition. So leave for that. What else, Robin, did I leave?
Well, this is also for the self-employed.
That was going to be one of my questions. Yeah.
Yes, not just for people who work for somebody else. So self-employed folks will be able to opt in should they want to do it. And then they have to do it, as I believe they have to commit to 3 years. And then at the end of 3 years, I think they can do it annually, but they have to commit to 3 years when they first opt in. So we have a lot of self-employed folks, and that was one of the big disappointments when we did this 4 years ago. I think that the Senate version that came back to us, that had been taken out. Anyway, so we've got that now, and we think that's a pretty important piece, and has a lot of
And that
support.
includes proprietors. So if someone is the owner of a small business, their employees are covered, but they are also covered.
Okay. What about folks who work part-time?
Yes, seasonal, part-time, self-employed, full-time, sort of everybody,
Mm-hmm.
right? Everybody who works.
Yeah, it's everybody, but folks who make less than $25,000 a year are going to receive their contributions back at the end of the year,
Okay.
though they're still covered.
Right. Right.
It's a way of making the rate structure more progressive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So people at the higher end well, it'll all be the same rate, but the dollar amount will be different. But we're trying to make sure that people at the lower end of the income scale can also afford to do this. So.
Mm-hmm. And will this insurance plan be managed by a private insurance company? Will it be managed by the state? Like, where will this sit?
This is an exciting change from the last version too. So it will be managed publicly, I think, for all the reasons we've talked about on the show before, about how important accountability is, and that government is incented to do good by its citizens, whereas the private sector provider is often incented to just make a profit, which often means that people don't get the benefits that they need. We talked about that quite a bit in the context of unemployment insurance, I think, maybe a year ago. But historically, this program is sat in the Department of Labor's office. And I think we all know how much the Department of Labor has been struggling these last few years. And so excitingly, we have asked the Treasurer's office to take on this program. Yeah, and that can go sort of, they were also beginning to roll out a retirement program. So those are two sort of nice parallel programs that can run.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that ramping this program up is going to take some initial like seed money or investment capital, however you want to call it. So how would this be kind of phased in financially?
Well, those startup funds are in Robin's camp over there in the appropriations committee. So I'm going to ask Robin.
Well, I can't speak a lot to it, but as the last time I looked at the bill, I think that we were talking about doing a one-time initial payment of $20 million to seed it and get it started up, and then eventually the insurance premiums are going to be going and filling it up, and covering, and that part of that 20 million is for, if I have this right, is for general startup costs. There's going to be IT costs, there's going to be some people costs, and then it's also going to be to help initial sort of down payment maybe on state employees as well. Is that, we have that right? So so that'll cover some of that, and then what we want to get to is a place where we have a 9-month reserve. Insurance companies have reserves in case there's something catastrophic or whatever. So we want to have a minimum of a 9-month reserve to cover, payments out to beneficiaries, benefits out to folks.
Right.
And that's another big difference from last time, right, Robin? So last time around, that startup money became something of a political problem because we had so much less revenue available. Right now, we have a decent amount of unexpected revenue that needs to be used for one-time costs and not ongoing costs. And this is the startup for this program is certainly a one-time cost.
Right. It's still a big chunk of money. I mean, the last time we were talking about a couple $1 million, and now we're talking about 10 times that. So there's a gulp happening in my throat at the committee, but this is a very unique time. In fact, we're going to be hearing, we will have heard by the time this airs, the updated revenue forecast for the rest of this year going on, and so that will make a difference or be comforting in terms of, yes, in fact, we do have more one-time money than we had expected to have. That's what I'm guessing here. And so that there is some availability for this.
Thank you, Robin. And I know you mentioned that, I think, Emily, you mentioned that there's a very inclusive definition of family. I am always curious about programs like this because I think a lot of folks assume that as a single person without a partner and without children, that I might not need a program like this. And yet I am a caretaker for a parent. And of course, myself, as I almost fell off the ladder painting a room the other day, I thought, that could have been an interesting little tumble. So let's just talk about family structures. And it sounds like this will cover single people. It sounds like it will cover.
So it would cover, Olga, I'm going to stay on the edge of revealing the right amount about your personal life. So it would cover, anytime you need to take off for your own medical needs, right?
Mhm.
And that would mean that your employer, if they're providing leave time right now, would actually have that paid for by the state program. And so your employer could use the money that they might be using right now to cover your leave time to actually cover the pay of someone who might be doing that work while you're gone, which makes leave, I think, quite relieving when you know someone's actually doing the work while you're
Right.
gone.
Yeah.
And then time you might spend caring for your mother, absolutely. Time you might have spent previously taking someone to treatment would be covered.
Mhm.
And then, if you're in a family relationship where someone is not legally a parent, whether that's a parent or a step parent,
Mhm.
there's a phrase in there in locus parentis. Am I saying that right, Robin?
Loco parentis.
In loco parentis, which is someone who has been in that relationship, basically in a parenting relationship, and either as the child in that relationship or as the parent in that relationship. And so that really, that covers, it means that we don't have to go into the full wild spectrum of whether fostering was sort of a legal arrangement or a mutual relationship. It covers sort of, aunts who take caretaking responsibilities and then are cared for in their older years. It covers that full range, which I think relieves a lot of the.
I
That
am.
was helpful.
And so one of the things that was in the Colorado definition, and I found it in a draft of the bill, it says, to expand this even further and be more inclusive, as shown by the qualified individual, any other individual whom the qualified individual has a significant personal bond that is or is like a family relationship, regardless of biological or legal relationship.
Very nice.
So, yeah.
Yep. That
And
is
so
good.
it's a real, I would call it a real queering of the family and a real experience, a real opportunity for the state to acknowledge all of the ways that folks live in these times.
Right.
Well, one reason I asked that question too, Emily, you and I have talked about how so many of our structures around, especially benefits, revolve around some old definitions of what work life looked like, what family life looked like, and people fall through the cracks when they don't fit the definition perfectly. So thank you for having that. That's an exciting definition to me.
Yes. It's a challenge because you're right. We can't think of everything. It's a lot easier to say what something is not than than all the things that it possibly could be, because there's a lot of permutation. So hopefully that last one, along with the in loco parentis, sort of covers the remaining.
Now, I know Emily, you and I have talked about this program before, but I don't think I've ever asked the question quite this way. We have looked out over the landscape of Vermont and asked the question, like, how could Vermont work better for everybody? And we often come back to things like wages and work life and that type of thing. How does this program kind of fit into that wider context of making Vermont work better for everyone? I mean, and like, why this program and not another benefit for workers? Just kind of looking for context here.
I think time to care. is really one of the most powerful things that we can do as a society living, under late stage capitalism or whatever we want to call these times. And that time to care, not just for other people, not just like, the mother who's burning the candle at, all three ends. But time to care for self, to be cared for. I don't think there are things I don't know if there's anything we can do that's sort of a more powerful move to tweak capitalism at the edges to make it more compassionate than to make time for care.
Mm-hmm.
And to make time for care in a way that doesn't, the wage replacement level in this bill is 100% right now.
Right.
And so that means that folks can afford to take the time. A lot of family leave programs nationally, and some that have been proposed in Vermont, for instance, the governor's proposal, have a wage replacement level that's low enough that if you're a low wage worker, there's no way you can actually afford to live on that medical leave, family leave, wage replacement level. And so people don't take it even though it's technically offered to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, this is as good as we can do.
Yeah.
Right.
But I agree. And I think that the low uptake, and we've seen this 60% is what the governor is saying for 6 weeks. It's laughable, and it's kind of insulting and lacks care.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about care. It lacks care and consideration for the people who are actually going to need it the most, who can't afford to do it. And how hard is that to say, oh, there's a program available, but I can't use it. It's just they're out of reach because it just can't possibly work for me.
Mm-hmm.
And to force people into making those kinds of decisions really exacerbates the problem. It doesn't do anything to fix it. And we did see a few years ago, and I'm sure there's more data that we could get on this, that the states that had the low percentage, like the 60%,
Mm-hmm.
had very low uptake, and it wasn't accomplishing their goals. So once they increased the percentage of the salary, that wage replacement that they got, the uptake would increase because people can afford to do it. And if employees are happy, this reduces turnover for businesses, which saves them money. It increases loyalty to the business. This is a recruitment tool for businesses. I mean, we have this set up now that the premium is paid 50-50 between the worker and the employer.
Mm-hmm.
But the employer could choose to say, I'll pay all of it. So if you're looking at jobs between two different companies and one will pay all of it and the other one is only going to pay half, that may sway you. So there's an ability for employers to have some control over what they would like to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of good reasons for.
Yeah. Well, what excites me too about that 100% wage coverage is it's very annoying to pay into a program and then not be able to benefit from it.
Times in my life where my health insurance has Olga, you were frozen, so I'm going to finish your sentence based on my own image.
Yes, thank you.
That, when I've had health insurance that underinsured me to a point where I couldn't afford to get the tests that I needed or get the treatment I needed. I know lots and lots of people throughout the country, right, who are experiencing that right now. So it's incredibly frustrating to be paying into a system that you can't access because you can't afford what access looks like. And this is, if we're going to create something new, why would we create something that just has the same bad policies built in? That's something where,
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So thank you for that 100% wage coverage. We have just about 5 minutes before the end of the first half of the show. What is really important for people to understand at this stage?
Well, I think it's helpful for people to just know. I know that our listeners really somehow enjoy when I do a little bit of process 101. So is it helpful for me to do that?
Sure.
Okay. So on Thursday, which is the going to be in the past when the show airs, the bill will be introduced on the floor with, as I said, the 104 signatures. That's called first reading. It will then be referred to a policy committee, and that will likely be the House General Committee, which handles tends to handle labor issues. And in that committee, it will then be picked up for testimony, which is called sorry, that's not called second reading. It'll just be picked up for testimony. It will have its time. That's a really good opportunity if folks have testimony that they want to share about how this would impact their lives. That's a really great opportunity for folks to get involved in the process in any direction. And so please reach out. Robin and I have a list running of folks who would be helpful to testify. So that's the opportunity for a lot of the storytelling, the nitty gritty. How will this improve my life? How might this particular way this is structured actually, I think, keep me from being able to use this program the way it's designed for, both employers and employees, workers. And so that's that opportunity. When the committee is done with that, and likely they will edit it significantly and vote it out of that committee, it will then get referred to the two money committees. So then it will go to the Ways and Means Committee. It'll go back to the floor, and the speaker will refer it to the Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee, where I sit, will spend time going deep into the revenue creation part of it. So that's the designing the insurance premium system. We'll spend time with that piece of the bill. And then we will vote it out ourselves if we all agree to, or actually if the majority of us agree to. And then it will go back to the floor again. And then the speaker will again refer it to a money committee. And it will go to the appropriations committee, where Robin will help guide it to make sure those initial appropriations that we talked about for the startup money and any staff positions are approved. And then if the appropriations committee says, the majority of them think this is a good idea, as they have changed it, it will go to the House floor. The House floor will vote on it. The majority of House members, that's called second reading. That's where most of the debate happens on the floor, the political theater. Then there'll be a second vote the next day called third reading. That's a minimum of debate usually, but this one's big enough. It might get good debate both days. House passes it, it gets messaged over to the Senate, and then the exact same process happens over in the Senate, and then it gets sent back to us for us to reconcile all the differences. And then likely we have a conference committee where we reconcile differences. And then after that, it goes to the governor. And the governor has a certain number of days to decide if the governor is going to sign it, let it pass into law without signature, or veto it. If the governor vetoes it, it goes back. We can't change it. We can just vote yes or no about overriding the veto. Both bodies need to do that. And that is the story of the bill's future.
There you go. Thank you, Emily. And Robin, anything you want to add to that about, or any other details you think people should understand at this time?
I feel like we've pretty well covered everything. If people want to read the bill, once it is introduced, you can go to the House General and Housing Committee, and the bill will be there. It also will be probably in our House calendar or journal at some point, but they can go. We don't have a number yet. We'll have a number by the time this is aired, but we don't know what that is. But they could go to the General Assembly website and go to the House General Committee page, and they'll find the bill there so that people can read it. And then the agenda, if they want to follow along, check the agenda for that committee for a while. And then once it's out of there, start checking the agenda for Ways and Means and then appropriations. So people can follow.
Yes. Yeah. And there's places too through the legislator's website if you want to give testimony. Isn't there a way to
submit written testimony to the committee while they're debating a bill? It's definitely not the most effective way to get your voice heard.
Okay.
And so testifying in person is always a little bit more effective, but you can always email the committee assistant, which is listed on each committee page if you are submitting written testimony.
Wonderful. And I would just add for our listeners, we often talk about reaching out to our representatives or our senators when there is a bill that's important to us. But I want to remind folks, regardless of where you sit on this particular insurance program, I would argue that it would probably behoove the governor to also hear from you, since he has been such a major part of this process the last two times it went through. And you can contact him through his website as well.
Thank you for saying that. That would be a good thing.
Yeah. And also want to remind people, I think our tendency here in 2023 is to tell someone when we don't like something, but
Mhm.
maybe not spend as much time telling people when we do like something. I would say the negative emails I get far outweigh the positive emails. And I don't think that's actually about me. So
I'm sure.
really encourage folks, like if you think this is a good idea and you're excited, please tell someone that too. It really just like gives some heart to the process.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Representative Robin Shy, thank you for joining us for this first segment of the show, and look forward to hearing how the bill progresses through the State House.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you, Olga.
The Montpelier Happy Hour will return on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro right after we hear from some of our underwriters.
Okay.
Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser, who is the regular contributor as well as one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro. And when this recording goes online, I hope you will check out the first half of the show where we talked with Representative Robin Shy about upcoming legislation around paid family medical leave insurance. So, Emily, what do we remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, not the station, not the platform, just the people doing the talking.
Why, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So this episode will go online on Friday, which I believe is the 20th, but today is the 16th, and it is Martin Luther King weekend, and wanted to just touch base with you, Emily, about what you're sitting with as a lawmaker on this important weekend.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really struck by Brattleboro used to have really sort of large events for Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and didn't this year. There's a really pretty like significant service at the White Church on Main Street.
Yeah.
That's a community event. There's usually something else that's outside somewhere. And this year, instead, there was a teach-in at the library on Saturday from the youth who are in the, gosh, I've completely forgot what the club is called, but it's the affinity club at BUHS for Black kids and kids of color. And it's all women and non-binary youth, mostly by coincidence, but it added a certain really lovely flavor to the whole thing. And it was a 2-hour community meeting talking about unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, and then spending some time unpacking our own views on race and racism and what to do about it. And as we're sort of living here in the whitest state in the country, as we work to diversify and are, I mean, I'm not diversifying it. I think, people are moving here and it's becoming more diverse. People are having babies and it's becoming more diverse. As that happens, I sort of appreciated this move this year from sort of the celebrations of the white liberal, which I think Reverend King had many things to say about, to a balance between self-reflection and action. And so I'm appreciating thinking about that. I'm appreciating getting ready to work on that. In that there was, of course, a number of folks working in the legislature on racial justice issues before this recent mid-pandemic racial awakening that we've had across the country.
Right.
But then there was sort of a wave of a, call to arms, call to action. And as that sort of recesses a little bit, I think we are wrestling with what sort of long-term systemic change looks like, integrating this into all of our work, not just sort of, there's the big public wins around police reform or land access. But when we're really doing the work of racial justice and unpacking as a government institutional racism, that's harder, longer work. It's looking like really deeply into policies and practices to see what needs to change. And so I'm looking forward to my colleagues' practice in that, and the community's practice in that. I was also struck at this event, just like how hard it is for folks to listen to Black girls. There was definitely a lot of my professional work is my professional paid work, not my professional political work, is about elevating the voices of Black girls in youth work nationally. And so it was interesting to sort of, see Brattleboro in that context, and see, once again, how much space some of the white men in the meeting took up exploring their own stuff.
Interesting.
And how patient and tolerant everyone was. And yeah, I guess that's some of what I'm sitting with. Yeah.
And, as a lawmaker, a little bit of what you just said also brings me back to that eternal question of, when making policy, how do we make sure that as many people are at the table as possible? With what you're sitting with now, is that giving you any insight on how to do that work better or more effectively?
Yeah, last biennium, I helped set up a working group of folks who are sort of nominated from counties around the state to really advise on that question. And we've implemented some of the changes they recommended in terms of setting up sort of norms for testimony, creating more environments for folks to give testimony, moving slower with certain legislation, bringing sort of new voices into the room, compensating folks for working group time.
Okay.
And then even just sort of the pandemic modification, making that permanent, of having everything be online and Zoom and YouTube and all of that. That's all a part of it. And then I'm holding out some hope that we're actually going to make changes to the reimbursement structure of actually being a legislator, which I'm hoping will bring more folks into the actual lawmaking process as legislators. And certainly we do have the most women of color that we've ever had in the state house as legislators this year, and that feels really exciting. And then I think we've sort of, enough time has gone by that each committee is starting to really understand what their role in the process is. And so when we talk about family medical leave, and in the first half of the show, and we talked about how high the reimbursement level needs to be for the program to be meaningful. When we don't do that, we know that who is left behind is poor folks and folks of color. And so it's remembering that. And I think Dr. King was really, especially, closer to the end of his life, was even more explicit about how
economic justice.
Yeah, about economic justice and how deeply that's wrapped up, and that solidarity around that, how deeply that's wrapped up in the needs of the civil rights movement. And so that's a lot of what I'm carrying, in ways and means, thinking about the wealth gap and thinking about that particularly in the context of Black folks. Those are like really deep and subtle policy changes that I can make, and I can do it without making like a huge big deal out of it too. Like it doesn't need to, not everything needs to be a headline bill.
Right.
We can make small changes that actually make a really big difference for people.
Thank you, Emily.
What are you sitting with, Olga?
Sitting with a couple things. One thing, when we were scheduling today's recording, even goes back to last night when you asked me, are you working today or do you have it off? And thinking about how many jobs I've had in my life where when it comes to holidays, the answer is always yes. And just so I'm kind of thinking, I guess for me it goes to Reverend King's work around economic justice, and I was thinking last night about the number of people who do not have the expansiveness or room to breathe in their economic life. So I've been sitting with that, and also the idea, I'm just right now I'm sitting with what you shared with the Saturday teach-in, and kind of about society, and in some ways when change happens we move forward quite a bit, and then in some of the small ways we don't move forward at all. And just that kind of an unevenness of change, and how much patience that takes, and how much willingness to keep coming back, and keep coming back even though the pace of change can be very slow at times, like deep systemic change, not just surface change. That's what I'm sitting with right now.
Yeah, I hear that. You know, it's funny. The organization I do a lot of paid work with is, I think, a minority white organization. And so it's interesting to have those conversations in that context. But thinking about this holiday and Juneteenth, and the fact that like somehow it's just like an opportunity for white collar workers to have the day off. Like, where is the justice in that?
Yeah. And what change does that actually make?
Yeah. And so like being more explicit in organizations that like, this is a day of service for white folks. And this is a day of rest for Black folks. Rest and community and celebration, right? And that like, and like organizations need to step up to set those norms. That's not something that each individual person can be responsible for. And in a context where like no one is resting enough, what does that mean?
Yeah. So this is a note to us, because this recording, kind of just note to listeners, snuck up on both Emily and I, but deeply. Let's make a note to us to be a little more intentional about Martin Luther King Jr. Day for 2024.
I appreciate that. Yeah, let's do that. There's also a lot of other stuff that's coming up this week. Yeah,
this week's going to be busy. There's some reports coming out, and tell us about the RAND study.
Yeah, so all of the things that are happening this week could all deserve a full hour show. So I'm going to go in the order of the days of the week, if that's okay with you.
No, that's fine.
That will help my brain. So on Tuesday, the e-board meets, or met, depending on how you're experiencing time on this podcast. I don't think we've ever been like so ridiculous about like the fact that we pre-record. Usually we just pre-record and don't talk about it.
Well, we
Anyway.
don't always do so many time sensitive things
We
on the
don't.
show.
It's
Yeah.
So anyway, the e-board met on Tuesday,
Mhm.
and the e-board is this super dorky, super cool thing, which stands for emergency board. And it's called the emergency board because it is a body, statutory body that can make financial decisions on behalf of the legislature and the administration in situations where those bodies can't convene. And
Okay.
so that's something that was like very useful in the pandemic,
Right.
or
Right.
or Hurricane Irene or whatever. But the other thing that the e-board does, and the e-board is made up of the governor and then the chairs of the 4 money committees. And the money committees are the 2 tax setting committees, finance and ways and means, and the 2 appropriations committees. So that's the e-board, 5 of us. I am now on the e-board. And the other thing that the e-board does, the main thing the e-board does, is approve the joint revenue forecast. So in order for a state to design its budget, you need to know how much money you have to spend.
Right.
Now, we could argue, and I will argue, I'm happy to argue, I think it's actually true, that it would be better to draft a budget based on how much you need and then find the money for it, or at least a balancing act between those 2 things. But we tend to do our state budgets based on how much money is available.
Right.
And so in a lot of states that don't have a joint revenue forecast, there's one revenue forecast from the administration and one revenue forecast from the legislature. And what that looks like is the 2 bodies, the administration and the legislature, draft their budgets based on different projections of how much money is available. And so the bottom line of those 2 budgets then needs to be reconciled. What? Ridiculous.
Wow.
So in one of the many ways that Vermont is just like so civil compared to the rest of the country, which we can argue is just because we're the whitest state in the country, but we're not going to do that today, maybe. We engage in a joint revenue forecasting process. So the state economists and the legislative economists get together, spend a whole lot of time in a room together and come up with a joint forecast based on all kinds of really cool economic modeling. And then twice a year, they reveal those revenue forecasts for the various funds and tell us what they think the economy is going to be doing for the next couple of years that should impact our budgeting and revenue raising process. And so that happens on Tuesday, or happened on Tuesday. And that's it all happens like in the governor's ceremonial office. Everyone sits in a velvet chair and the media comes, and it's all like very
That's right. It's very yep.
And so that happened. And I'm in an awkward position where I'm not allowed to reveal what they're going to say until they say it, even though we're after the facts. Maybe we can put like a show note on that one, Olga. I'm sorry.
Well, we should probably talk about it at an upcoming show too.
Yes, but what I will say is that, the legislative economist did some sort of economic updating when we had a joint session right before the legislative session started in December. And he talked about how while the sort of big bubble of federal money is going away, that doesn't mean that we're going to like dive deep into the tank. We're still going to have more revenue than we did pre-pandemic. And it will be sort of following a growth curve that might be the same shape as the growth curve before the pandemic, but it's being reset at a higher level than it was pre-pandemic.
Interesting.
So we've sort of like jumped thresholds around what the new normal is.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And then there's lots of other stuff that we can talk about another time. And then the other thing that's really exciting that's happening this week, last week, is
that's the new name of our show.
This week, last week. I kind of love it. The Montpelier Happy Hour.
This
week, last week, how it all shook out. Maybe that's what I'll call my newsletter this week.
I like it.
Is the child financing study from the Rand Corporation. So as we've talked about on the show before, the legislature put in statute last biennium that no family should pay more than 10% for their child care.
Yes.
and a bunch of other stuff about living wages for childcare employees and high quality system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that we set that intent very clearly in statute. And then the question is like, how do we actually make that happen?
Right.
And so our joint fiscal office commissioned a really massive study that explored the cost of care
Mm-hmm.
and the resources that families have available to pay for that cost of care.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sort of waiting on that study to make our next decisions about how much revenue we need to raise to really drastically reinvent our childcare system, what governance decisions we need to make to drastically update our childcare system. And so that is all happening this week.
Mm-hmm. And remind me, Emily, I'm sorry I don't know the answer to this. When we're talking about childcare, we're talking birth to.
So right now,
Mm-hmm.
our public school system covers 5-year-olds and up.
Okay.
And so we're talking about anyone who's under the age of 5. And we can
Thank
call it early care and education if we want to use the proper technical term.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that some of the time is spent in care and some of the time is spent in education. It's that caretaking is educational.
Right.
Like,
yep.
Kids learn things in their brain when they're being cared for.
Yeah.
And so generally that starts at 3 months.
Okay. Well, the reason I asked is I know there's also been conversation about like, when does childcare begin and end, and when does the public school system begin and end, and where do they overlap, where do they not?
And I think that's going to be a big part of this conversation this upcoming biennium for
okay.
What systems pay for the care and how does that affect what the care is. So if some ages are being funded through the education fund and through our public school system
Mm-hmm.
of education, does that change the actual delivery of services?
Right.
That kind of stuff.
It's going to be a fascinating read.
It will be. It will be. And I think definitely we should do a show just on all of that soon.
Yeah. And was there another report due to come out either around property taxes or?
Ooh, yes. So actually the task force that I was on this summer on the income-based education taxes, that report came out, both the tax department's report on that and the committee's report on that came out at the end of December.
Right, okay.
But next week, I believe, the Office of Property Valuation and Review, PVR, which is part of the tax department, is coming out with a few reports, one of them being their annual PVR report, which one member of my committee is just like, it's his favorite thing that happens all year. And he just like lives for getting that report. But there's a number of accompanying reports this year that dive deeper into certain aspects of property valuation and review. And I'm really looking forward to diving into that issue. So that is, how we appraise properties, how we adjust the appraisal of properties, how we adjust tax rates to equalize the appraisal of properties with our common level of appraisal, how all those things fit together, how communities handle things in the face of challenging staffing levels and all of that. So that's going to be, there's this really interesting part of that whole puzzle where owners of high value properties, of course, have an incentive to challenge the finding of how high a level their property is appraised at, right?
Right.
And towns often don't have the financial capacity or the human capacity, staffing capacity to defend those appraisal values in court.
Interesting.
And given that a decent share of the property taxes in a given community actually goes to the education fund, not to the municipal fund, the town also doesn't have a real financial interest in defending that property valuation because they don't really get the bulk of the money from that property valuation. The state does.
Right.
And so we're going to explore more what it takes for the state to support communities and defending those property valuations. So that's just like one little nugget of detail on all the fun that happens in the property valuation world.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Emily. I love this time of year because it seems like all the reports, like December to maybe the beginning of February, all these
January
reports,
15th.
yeah, all these reports come through, and
Mhm.
they're always full of such interesting information. I kind of wish they came out in like August, so everybody had a chance to digest them before you're launched into the policy making.
I would even be happy if they came out December 15th, Olga. Like, that would even be a plus.
That
It's
would
just,
be even better. Yeah. Well, just a few minutes before the end of the show, uh, anything else we want to leave listeners with before we head out?
um, this weekend I was in town because we had a constituent meeting for a couple hours on Saturday morning.
Mhm.
And then I attended that event from the UHS high schoolers. And then I was going to wait tables in the evening. And so I was in town for like an hour and a half in between those things. Didn't make sense to
Okay.
go home in between. And so I went to Shinla and I got myself a hot noodle soup on a really cold day. And I read legislative reports, my bowl of hot noodle soup. And I had somehow managed to forget how incredibly comforting the hot noodle soup is from Shinla when you are cold and tired and maybe overwhelmed by the humans. And I just want to give a shout out for occasionally some things don't change, and that's great.
Yes. Yes, the hot noodle soup is a place of comfort at
Mhm.
Shinla's.
Yeah. And I sort of towards that end of the humans and the overwhelm, I just want to say if folks are running into me in town over these next few weekends, I am making a transition from working from home and barely seeing anyone to being around hundreds and hundreds of people every day. And I'm a little bit broken on the weekends. And so I'm trying my best to be friendly, but I'm a little shell shocked.
Yeah. So yeah, the glazed look.
There's a yeah.
I hear you. I used to be that way after deadline night on, Tuesday
Yes.
night at the paper. If I went grocery shopping, people would try to talk to me and I'm like, so I hear you, honey. I hope you have time on the weekends to just decompress.
Mhm.
Find some time to do that. Well, the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, will return next week, Friday at 2 p.m. You can also find us on BCTV and wherever you find your podcasts. And Emily, where can
Mhm.
people find you in the interwebs?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, and there you can sign up for my newsletter or follow me on any of my social media accounts or find my email address or phone number.
Thank you. Hey, everyone, have a great weekend.